Welcome back. Today I'm going to return to a topic I've discussed before, which is the topic of unstated symbolic meanings or allusions to the Old Testament in the Gospels and why we should be dubious of them. I'm trying to do it a little differently this time, so I hope it will come across as sufficiently fresh content by focusing on literature and the roles that unstated symbolism and allusion can play, and the kind of deliberateness that has to go into them and literary quality that they produce, and then arguing from that for the proposition that the genre of the Gospels really is not conducive to that. It doesn't fit well with that kind of literary goal and deliberateness. Now, I want to be very clear about a couple of things right up front to forestall some possible confusions. I'm talking about unstated allusion or symbolism allegedly arising from narrative elements. Now, in arguments for this kind of thing in the Gospels, for subtle symbolism and so forth, we often find that explicit references to the Old Testament or explicit teachings of Jesus are mashed together with the claims of unstated symbolism or allusion, and with really poor arguments for that, and just treating it all as if it's all of a piece. So obviously I'm not denying that Jesus refers to the Old Testament. He does often. I'm not denying that he refers to Moses or David or Adam or other Old Testament persons. I'm also not denying that the Gospels say sometimes that some event fulfilled an Old Testament verse or fulfilled prophecy or something like that. In fact, later in this video, I'm going to argue that the explicitness of their references is actually to some extent evidence against their making inexplicit references. And I'm not denying that Jesus talks about the law a lot, like the Mosaic law. He does. He talks about it a lot. But what I'm questioning is the proposition that the gospel authors use details of their narratives, the stories that they tell, in an unstated way to allude to some Old Testament passage or to symbolize some sort of theme that they want to talk about. So I'm talking about things like the claim, this was a new one to me, I just learned about it a couple of days ago from an article that someone sent me, that Jesus' baptism in the Jordan River by John the Baptist represents Moses crossing the Red Sea. Or that, and obviously, Matthew doesn't say anything of the kind, or that the green grass in Mark at the feeding of the 5,000 is an allusion on Mark's part, a deliberate allusion to Psalm 23, he makes me to lie down in green pastures. That the 153 fish represent the Trinity or the universality of salvation or something of that kind. You begin to get a sense of what I'm talking about by unstated allusions arising from the narrative elements of the story. Now, I want to say up front, please, 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 I actually have that written in my notes, please, 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 do not respond to my posting this video by saying, but if something is symbolic, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not historical, or, but it's possible that it could be both, or, but why not both? I'm addressing why I think it's improbable that it is both. But this is a probabilistic argument. It doesn't address a probabilistic argument to talk about mere logical possibility. And I've run into this again and again. On one recent occasion, I actually explicitly tried to forestall that, and the person I was discussing with came back and said, but it doesn't entail that it's not historical. if it is symbolic. And I said, but I already addressed that. And then he said, well, I don't even think it's evidence that it's not historical, or that if it's historical, that's evidence that it's not symbolic. And I'm like, well, that's a different question. It's a completely different question. Non-deductive evidential relations refer to things that are compatible in a strict logical sense. So, for example, it's possible that by the time you see this video, I have already died and I no longer exist, even if you see it on the very first day when it was automatically published. It's possible. It's not even, like super duper duper far-fetched, but it's improbable. If it happens, you'll have a laugh, but it's not the way to bet. But there are even more far-fetched things. It's compatible with this video that I am a space alien, okay, and that I am pretending to be an Earth-born human being. That's possible. That's compatible with the evidence that you have for my human nature, my talking about, being born here on Earth and so forth. But maybe I'm just lying about all of that. There are lots of things that are compatible with one another. There are lots of things that don't entail the falsehood of one another, but nonetheless are negatively related probabilistically. So please don't come in and say, well, it could be both, or that doesn't necessarily mean. I'm aware of that, but I think it's improbable that the gospel authors, given their genre that they are working in, are making these unstated symbols or allusions by way of their narrative elements. And I think that it's also improbable that they're doing that and that it's historical. In fact, I think that if they're narrating historically in the way that they seem to be, that's some evidence against their having these unstated literary allusions. All right. I'm going to be claiming that the act of aiming for a particular literary quality that we find from unstated symbolism or allusion is very rare in the genre that I think the Gospels are in. In fact, I don't know of any cases, but I'm just going to go for very rare. Therefore, to the extent that we have evidence for that genre, we have some evidence against the occurrence of unstated symbolism or allusion from the narrative elements of the story. I'm going to start from the literature side. Now, my PhD is in English. I love literature, okay? But I'm going to show you how unstated references in fiction work, and then they can be very cool, very, very exciting to find, very beautiful. But I'm hoping that those examples will sort of spark even more understanding of why we don't expect to find this inductively. We don't expect to find this in the genre of memoir reportage that is close to the facts. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 different categories of unstated symbolism or allusion in non-historical literature that's not completely historical. In fact, all of the examples I'll be giving come from fiction, just from fiction. Okay, the first type is what people call an Easter egg. Now, what I mean by this is that if you know, you know. If you don't know, you don't know. But it's just a little extra cool thing in the story. And the example I'm going to give is from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. The books, of course, the movies are not canon, in my opinion. And that at the end of toward the end of the 3rd book, The Return of the King, the downfall of Sauron, the evil enemy, occurs on March 25th. And Gandalf tells this to the hobbits. I think it's Sam he's speaking to, and he says, from now on, the new year will always begin on the day when the realm of Sauron ended, I think he says, and you were brought out of the fire to the king. Now, if you know, you know. March 25th is the Feast of the Annunciation, 9 months before Christmas. Makes sense. Not that, the people who set this up were literally saying that Jesus was conceived on March 25th, but if we're going to celebrate Christmas on December 25th, then 9 months before that would be a good time to celebrate the Annunciation. Tolkien, of course, was a devout Catholic, and the statement that the new year will always begin then also fits with a British custom, for all I know, may still be the custom, that for some financial purposes and other purposes, a kind of a fiscal year begins on the Feast of the Annunciation, March 25th. All right, so now I don't want to disappoint you. I don't think this is a super big deal for understanding the Lord of the Rings. Some people think it's an even bigger deal. I just think it's a nice extra. Okay, so now I'm gonna, but of course, there's no way to mention that. It's a completely different universe. But in our universe, you could pick up on it. All right, next one is going to be a literary allusion from one work of literature, deliberately forming its events to model that of another work of literature. This is going to be from The Deathly Hallows by J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter book. Maybe this is a little spoilerish, but hopefully not too much. All right, in that book, the evil Lord Voldemort declares to Harry that he has 1 hour to give himself up, or Voldemort's going to destroy Hogwarts and all of Harry's friends. So Harry agrees. He comes to the stated location in the woods to give himself up. He's willing to die for his friends. And when he arrives, Lord Voldemort is surrounded by his evil Death Eaters, and they all start mocking and jeering, and oh, he showed up, and just making fun of him, and it's a very, very dark moment in the story. Now, this is clearly, I think, beyond all question of a doubt, an allusion to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, where Aslan agrees to give his life for Edmund the traitor, and the witch says, okay, you have to come and give up your life to me. And so Aslan goes to the stated place and comes in the night to that stone table, and at the stone table there's the witch and all of her evil henchmen, and when Aslan shows up they all start laughing and jeering, and oh, he's come, the great cat, and making fun of him and so forth. I think there's no question that Rowling is modeling that scene after that other scene. And that kind of adds something to your appreciation. Not that I'm going to go into a big discourse here on to what extent Harry is or isn't a Christ figure. That's not my intention. But I'm just saying that Rowling is alluding to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe there. The third type of unstated metaphor, unstated representation, symbolism in the events of a story is the most profound. And this is when you have kind of an ongoing, unstated metaphor in the events of the novel, correspondence. And there are all these different ways that you recognize it, and it adds a layer of depth to the novel. Now, I'm talking about, for this example, this novel, The Chosen by Chaim Potok. If you like fiction and you have never read this novel, do yourself a favor and read this novel. It is one of the great novels of the Western world, I don't hesitate to say, and much more so than any of Potok's other novels. I've read most or all of them at this point, and this one really stands out. It's just amazing. It's the story of two Orthodox Jewish boys growing up in New York City during World War II. One of them is what's known as modern Orthodox. He keeps the commandments and all of that, wears a skull cap, goes to synagogue and believes, what would be regarded as a pretty conservative strain of Judaism. But he's not a Hasid. And he forms an unlikely friendship with Danny, who is from a much stricter Hasidic group or sect, ruled over by Danny's father, the Reb Saunders. And the strange thing, very strange theme of the novel, is that Reb Saunders is raising Danny in silence. Ever since Danny came to a certain age but was still a little boy, Reb Saunders stopped talking to him, just in any ordinary conversations. The only time Reb Saunders talks to his son is when they are studying the Talmud. And they do study the Talmud, but that's the only time they talk together. And when Reuven, the viewpoint character, who is the more modern Orthodox, learns this, he's just aghast. He can't figure out why Reb Saunders would do such a thing. And you become aware pretty quickly in the story that the relationship of Reb Saunders to his son Danny is an extended metaphor for the relationship of God to mankind, and even specifically to the Jews. And that Potok is exploring the problem of divine hiddenness and the problem of evil and the pain that is caused by the fact that God doesn't speak more directly to us. But that's never explicitly stated. The two themes are both there in the stories running along on parallel tracks, but, and it's obvious enough, but you're left to infer it for yourself. Even the fact that Danny and his father only talk when they study Talmud is, of course, mirrored by the idea that we can only hear God speak when we read his word and we study his word. In this case, because they're Orthodox Jews, speaking of the Old Testament. Okay, and one of the clearest indications of this, but still not an explicit statement, comes in just a little scene that I'm going to read to you, super brief clip from the novel. This is after the death camps have been discovered. And Reb Saunders has had his own response to that, as you'll see, and Reuven's father has a very different take on it. So Reuven is telling his father about a conversation at the Saunders house. "How is Reb Saunders?" he asked quietly. That's the father. I told him what Reb Saunders had talked about that afternoon. My father nodded slowly. Reb Saunders wanted to know how God could let something like this happen, I told him quietly. My father looked at him, his eyes somber. And did God answer him? He asked. His voice had a strange quality of bitterness to it. I didn't say anything. Did God answer him, Reuven? My father asked again, that same bitterness in his voice. Reb Saunders said it was God's will. We have to accept God's will, he said. My father blinked his eyes. Reb Saunders said it was God's will, he echoed softly. I nodded. You are satisfied with that answer, Reuven? No. He blinked his eyes again, and when he spoke, his voice was soft, the bitterness gone. I am not satisfied with it either, Reuven. We cannot wait for God. If there is an answer, we must make it ourselves. I was quiet. Okay, so obviously that's two very different approaches to how we respond to the silence of God. But did God answer him, right? Okay, and we've already learned in the novel that Reb Saunders himself does not answer his son's ordinary questions. Okay, he's placed this distance between them. And as the novel goes on, you find out why he did that. And that, again, has all these echoes in terms of the silence of God. All right. Now, there's a very narrow line that the author has to walk when he's doing something like that. It's very, very profound. It's part of what makes that novel so great. He has to make his metaphor obvious enough that the reader can pick up on it, because the author, a good author, wants his reader to pick up on that. He wants, and the more profound and important and central the metaphor is to his book, the more he wants the reader to pick up on it. But he wants to avoid, for that particular literary quality, he wants to avoid saying it outright, expressing it outright, because that would be what we might call too on the nose. Now, there are novelists who do come out and say their metaphors outright. That was part of what made it hard for me to find the best example here. I was looking at some novels by Wendell Berry, which are also very, very good. But I found that Berry breaks that rule, that show don't tell rule. He just comes right out and says, what the metaphor of the spider web is in Jayber Crow and so forth. And somehow he gets away with it too, still making it a really good novel. But often there is that goal, at least, to try to have something there, but have it just enough below the surface that the reader gets that sort of feeling of revelation or that aha moment as he figures it out for himself. But it's not like super hard. It's not just a private mind game that the author is playing. Now, as a matter of induction, I would say that it is very rare, if ever, that we see such things in reportage with a primarily testimonial purpose. But we find them pretty frequently in fictional works. We even find things in partially fictional works, because to just that degree, the author is not constrained by truth in what he can do with his symbolism. If he wants a historical character's birthday to be a symbol for something and he's making a movie based on true events, he can just change that person's birthday so that it falls on the day when something else happened, or he can change the day when something else happened so that it falls on that character's birthday. So there's this leeway, because you're not just telling about truth. But also the at least partially fictional author is creating a kind of a work of art, and he's not exclusively focused on his purpose to tell the truth. He's also focused on his purpose to create this artifact with the special literary beauties of an artifact. And what you find in critical scholarship all the time when you read it is that they come to the Gospels with the assumption that the author has this very strong literary purpose. Okay, that, John wants to echo this theme, or Matthew wants to bring this out, and then they'll just say with great confidence, this symbolizes this, or that symbolizes that. In fact, I even read one scholar who said that he used to think, as part of being a scholar, that the New Testament scholar shouldn't even try to say what parts of the Gospels were historical and which weren't. That he should just talk about the Gospels as literary artifacts. Now, he said he had changed his mind. I don't think he's changed his mind quite enough, but let that lie. The point is, that's what they're trained to do. They're trained to think about these as at least one very primary, very big purpose is a literary purpose. And I question that, because when something is this kind of memoir reportage very close to the facts, it very rarely, if ever, has a literary purpose as a big major primary purpose to it. And this is especially true when we're not talking about some work of history that spans, centuries. To some extent, if you're writing, some 5-volume work about the history of the world or something, you might be treating it more as having some grand literary quality. I'm not sure you're going to have unstated symbolism even there. I have my doubts, but it's a little more likely to arise there. But when something is very close to the facts, either someone who claims to have witnessed them or who's talking to someone who claimed to have witnessed them, and you're just kind of telling them, in a somewhat spontaneous way, you're not going to get this. And we see this in a common sense way. Here's an example I've used before. Forgive me for using it again. Suppose that a friend comes to you and he says, I saw a car accident today. A red car ran the red light and it collided with a green car. And suppose that he's telling you this story in December, just shortly before Christmas. He would rightly think that you were very strange if you said to him, wow, I see what you're doing there. That's really profound. You're saying that the fact that we're hurrying around so much, preparing for Christmas, we're in such a hurry going to the store and all like that we're causing collisions and we're bumping into one another and we're losing the spirit of Christmas, and we're having these kinds of accidents because of our haste and our hurry, and the fact that you're using red and green cars there, that's really profound, man. He's gonna look at you. He's gonna say, no, there are plenty of red and green cars out there. I'm just telling you that the red car ran the red light and collided with the green car because that's what happened. I'm not trying to make any profound point about Christmas. Now, imagine how he would feel if you then responded and said, oh, no, I'm not doubting that what you're saying is historical. Why not both? It could be both. I just think that you had this other purpose as well as the purpose of making it historical and telling me something that really happened. He's still going to think you're being really weird because, A, it's not all that improbable that a red car and a green car would collide in December. I mean, that's not much of a quote-unquote coincidence to accept. And B, when people are just talking and just telling each other about something that happened, that they know happened, that they observed happened, they don't usually do that. They're not so focused on themselves and their role as an artist with a capital A and what they're trying to put into that artifact. These kinds of considerations influence what we might call our prior probabilities, but I think they influence them very profoundly. As I said, there's nothing all that unlikely about a red and green car colliding in December. We're justified in ignoring the merely possible idea that he's making an unstated symbolic meaning. Well, similarly, there's nothing deeply improbable about the so-called coincidence where Mark says that something about Jesus seeing the people as a sheep without a shepherd, and then a little while later, Mark is narrating about the feeding of the 5,000, that they sat down on the green grass, and Psalm 23 is a shepherd psalm and mentions the green grass. That's not that improbable. David really was a shepherd, so he used that. As of course if you follow my undesigned coincidence work, the time of year made it, which we only learned from John, made it plausible that the grass really would be green. It's the kind of thing that would stand out to someone. Mark's source was probably Peter, who was probably there, and so forth. So it's well explained without any allusion on Mark's part in his mind. Oh, I'm going to say that because the grass is green. And it's not an answer to this to say, but it's possible that he was doing both. Well, a lot of things are possible, but that's not the way to bet. This, to some extent, there's a tension there. If Peter's just spontaneously telling what he remembers, and Mark is trying to get this down, then that kind of vivid quality of the grass being green can just be totally explained in that way. It also helps us to see that, as with the red and green car in December, certain things really aren't all that coincidental. Okay, so people will say, are you saying this is just a coincidence? Like it's almost, beyond belief. So I'm going to give an example here, the idea that Matthew is alluding to Moses crossing the Red Sea by telling the story of Jesus' baptism. So the author of the article I was reading, which I may say more about in other videos, tried to make kind of a big deal about the fact that in the previous chapter, before the chapter where the baptism occurs, they come back from Egypt to Israel in Jesus' infancy, that his family and his parents return out of Egypt to Israel, and then that in the next chapter Jesus is baptized, and then that in the next chapter after that he goes out into the wilderness and is tempted by the devil in the wilderness. So this was said to be this Moses sequence. See, they leave Egypt, and then they cross the Red Sea, and then they go out into the wilderness, for 40 years. But you start to realize other points that make this really not that surprising. So, for example, Jesus' infancy and the return from Egypt, assuming it really happened, did take place before his baptism, because his baptism was in his adulthood. So it's extremely plausible that that's going to take place in a previous chapter, and none of the Gospels have a lot of stories about Jesus' infancy, none of the canonical Gospels, or his childhood, so that it would take place in the immediately previous chapter is also not implausible. And the synoptics do begin, all three of the synoptics begin their story of Jesus' ministry with the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. So Matthew's just sharing that with Mark. So it's very plausible that after telling what few infancy stories he has, he's just going to jump to the beginning of Jesus' ministry with the baptism of John the Baptist. Moreover, it's common to all the synoptics that Jesus immediately went out into the wilderness after his baptism. And Mark even uses the word immediately. So that isn't some big coincidence. Those two things are linked chronologically in an extremely literal way in all three of the synoptics. So there's nothing surprising about that sequence that requires, some explanation in the order of events in the life of Moses. Moreover, there are huge disanalogies here. The baptism of Jesus isn't like the story of the Red Sea at all. Jesus doesn't need to be saved from a pursuer by crossing the Jordan River. He doesn't part the waters. He presumably actually got wet when he was baptized instead of crossing dry shod. There isn't even reason to believe that he crossed the Jordan in the act of being baptized. It's quite plausible that he went in and back out on the same side. So what would we mean by saying, oh, you're just saying this is a coincidence? What's just a coincidence? A story involving water? A story involving somebody going into a body of water and coming back out of a body of water? I mean, there's not even much of a coincidence there to be explained. Either in, and it's a different body of water too. It's the Jordan River instead of the Red Sea. In fact, the literal Jordan River has a place in the history of Moses and the people of Israel because it's the river that they have to cross later. Moses is not allowed to cross, but at the end of the wandering in the wilderness. So we're kind of ignoring that fact, and the fact that this is the Jordan River, we're making it like the Red Sea because they encounter that at the beginning of their sojourn, before their sojourn in the wilderness, so we can create this alleged pattern of, coming out of Egypt, going through the Red Sea, going out into the wilderness. It's gerrymandered. So it's really not convincing at all, but it helps in terms of the psychology of epistemology to have a kind of robust common sense when you approach these things, and then you start realizing all of these disanalogies, so you feel very confident just saying, yeah, it really is just a coincidence. Okay, reportage memoirs are not highly polished. They do not have literary pretensions or sophistication. And I also would add there is an earnestness that we see in the Gospels, which you might almost call a naive earnestness. The Gospel authors are not shy about telling you when they think there's some connection with Old Testament history or an Old Testament prophecy. You remember that I said earlier that a fiction author has to walk a fine line between making his metaphor sufficiently obvious that the reader can enjoy it and pick up on it, but sufficiently subtle that it's not too on the nose. The gospel authors, I believe, are not willing to take that risk. They don't care about being too on the nose. They want to be sure you get it. And so that's why they have no qualms whatsoever about just pausing and stopping and saying, this happened, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet. Okay? They will look upon him whom they have pierced for the piercing of Jesus' side. Not a bone of him shall be broken, and so forth. Out of Egypt have I called my son, which, by the way, is the nation of Israel, not Moses, the son in Hosea. Okay, so they're not concerned about their literary legacy. They're not concerned about making people have that kind of profound jolt when they recognize something that isn't stated outright. They just state it outright because they really, really want to be sure that their readers can profit from what they think is there. I think that if you added up all the authors or speakers who have used unstated allusion or symbolism in the narrated events of their stories, and we had sort of the probability space laid out in front of us with, memoir reportage from very close to the facts over here, and all its negation over here, the different possibilities there, partial fiction and so forth, you would find that the vast majority, if not all, of the authors who do that would be over on the side of the negation of memoir reportage. So what this means is that we shouldn't hastily gloss over this question. We shouldn't be so quick to say, okay, yeah, maybe Matthew is meaning to allude to the crossing of the Red Sea, or maybe John is meaning to allude to the number of all the fish in the world, or the Trinity, or something, by the 153 fish. But that doesn't mean it's not historical. We shouldn't move so fast. Don't be so fast. When I recently had a discussion with Philip Goff, it was interesting. If you saw that, he said, the 153 fish are obviously not historical. They're obviously symbolic. What do you mean, someone counted them? I'm like, yeah, they had to get them out of the net in order to use the net, So it makes perfect sense that someone counted them, and it was a great catch. And why is the fact that it's a specific number something that makes it obviously a metaphor? You see, that's this approach that isn't taking seriously the theory that this is just somebody telling you what happened. When you see a specific number that you hone in on, what's he getting at with that? Okay, all right. And we should realize that there's a reason why skeptics so often use such claims as evidence against the historicity of these details. Not because it's logically impossible that something could be both, but because it is some non-deductive evidence. And in a non-deductive way, these two things press against one another somewhat. Now, the good news is that we have really strong evidence that the Gospels are memoir reportage. Not just that they are true, though that's part of it, of course, but that they have this spontaneous quality. For example, there are the unexplained allusions I've talked about, such as the debate over purification that John the Baptist's disciples had in John 3, and we never learn what the debate was about. That just kind of drops off the radar. That's the quality you get when someone's telling a story, okay, that he just knows is true. He doesn't always pause to, he'll maybe drop something in, but not pause to go back and pick it up and explain it. Or odd details, unnecessary, even weird details, like Peter putting his coat on before jumping into the water in John 21. Why did he put his coat on? You would normally take your coat off. And it's not that we can't think of reasons, but all that the narrator says is because he was stripped for work. And it's like, well, okay, but still, it's more convenient to swim if you're, if you don't have a coat on, okay? But that, it's that mark of that witness testimony, and that the person is just telling it like it is and like it happened, and it's not highly polished. It doesn't have those literary pretensions. And you can start to see that texture of testimony and that spontaneous quality that is sometimes awkward. Now, there is a sort of wonderful profundity and what I might call coolness in something like what I told you about in The Chosen. I love that quality. That's why I was so enthusiastic about that novel and recommended it to you. But I think that perhaps sometimes people have become too invested in the idea that the Gospels have that kind of coolness, that they have that kind of exciting property where there's all these unstated layers of symbolism in the details, and where you can say, oh wow, Jesus being baptized in the Jordan River is like Moses crossing the Red Sea, and then before that was leaving Egypt, and after that is going out into the wilderness, and Matthew is presenting Jesus as the new Moses, and we've got all this other stuff, even though Matthew doesn't say so. Wow, cool. And there's this feeling that you're really losing something if you give that up. But I would suggest that we should reorient ourselves and start to get excited about a different kind of coolness. The coolness of just telling things because they happened and struck someone. All right, the grass really was just green, and that's in Peter's mind's eye when he tells the story. There just really were 153 fish, and you can picture those laughing faces of the, I think, rather young Galilean fishermen tossing them out of their net to empty the net and counting and just shaking their heads full of joy because Jesus is risen, and they just caught 153 fish, but the net didn't break, and the young Yohanan will never forget it. And when he's old, he'll put it in his memoirs. Now that's exciting. That is exciting in itself. And that's the kind of thing I like to emphasize here at the Lydia Magruder channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.